So imagine this. You've done it. You finally bought your first home. That feeling, right? Just incredible.
Absolutely, pure excitement.
Then, maybe a few months later, you get this property tax bill in the mail. And you look at it, and it's for the whole year, even for the months before you own the place.
That moment of confusion. Wait, why am I paying for January when I bought it in August?
Exactly. And that's pretty much the situation Harold from Fort Lauderdale wrote in about. He's asking, why this huge bill?
Yeah, it's a great question and honestly a really common one. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack that using insights from Gary M. Singer's Q&A column.
Right. Our mission here is to really clarify why you, the new homeowner, might get that full year bill and, what the actual process is supposed to look like.
Let's get into it. So Harold closed maybe a few months back, and now he's got this tax bill demanding payment for the entire calendar year.
Yeah, and on the surface, it just doesn't feel quite right, does it? Why pay for time? You weren't the owner.
Well, the first thing to grasp is how property taxes generally work. The local tax collector, they operate on an annual cycle. For simplicity, they send out one bill per property per year.
Okay, one bill once a year. Makes administrative sense for them, I guess.
Exactly. Now, when a house sale happens mid-year, they don't issue two separate bills. Instead, the adjustment happens at closing. It's called proration.
Proration, okay, I've heard that term. What does that actually mean for Harold in this situation?
So during the closing process, the closing agent takes the estimated or known annual property tax amount,
Uh-huh.
and they calculate how many days of that tax year the seller owned the property and how many days the buyer, Harold, will own it.
Right, dividing it up based on the closing date.
Precisely. So if the seller is responsible for the taxes from the start of the tax year up to the closing date. The buyer is responsible from the closing date to the end of the year.
So theoretically, the seller should have already covered their share. How does that happen?
Usually, yes. On the closing statement, that big stack of papers you sign, there should be a line item showing a credit from the seller to the buyer.
Ah, a credit.
Yeah, that credit represents the seller's share of the annual taxes. They're essentially giving Harold the money up front to cover their portion.
Okay, so the seller pays their share to Harold at closing.
That's the standard way. So when the actual tax bill arrives later, even though it's for the full year.
Harold's the owner then, so the bill comes to him and he has to pay the whole thing.
Exactly. The tax collector needs the full amount from the current owner. Harold is responsible for making that full payment.
It still feels a bit counterintuitive, though.
Think of it like maybe sharing a big meal with a friend. Your friend eats their share, pays you for their portion, and then leaves.
Okay.
When the final bill for the whole meal comes, you're the one still sitting there, so you pay the whole thing.
Yeah.
But you've already got your friend's contribution in your pocket. Harold should have the seller's contribution from that closing credit.
That's a helpful analogy. Got it. But what if the estimate used at closing was wrong? Say the actual tax bill comes in higher than they estimated.
Ah, good point. That definitely happens. Most purchase contracts have a clause for this. Sometimes it's called a reimbursement clause or a tax adjustment clause.
Okay, what does it do?
Well, it basically says that if the actual tax bill is significantly different from the estimate used for the proration at closing, the buyer and seller agree to settle the difference later.
So if the credit Harold got was too small because the estimate was low.
He might be able to go back to the seller based on that contract clause and ask for the additional amount to cover their fair share of the actual bill.
So he should check his contract and closing docs carefully for that clause.
Absolutely. Read the fine print. See what it says about post-closing adjustments for taxes.
So even if the credit wasn't quite right, Harold's immediate responsibility is still paying that full tax bill that just arrived. He can't just pay part of it.
No, he needs to pay the full amount to the tax collector to avoid penalties or loons. His recourse for getting the correct share from the seller comes after he's paid the bill, by invoking that contract clause, if it exists.
Okay, so wrapping this up then. Getting that full year bill is normal, even if it seems weird at first.
Right. The system relies on that proration credit happening at closing. The buyer pays the full bill later, having hopefully already received the seller's share.
And if the numbers were off, there's often a way to true it up later through the contract.
Correct. It highlights how important understanding that closing statement in the purchase contract really is.
So for you listening, especially if you're a new homeowner like Harold, maybe pull out those closing documents, take another look with this understanding, see how the taxes were handled.
Yeah, definitely worth doing. And, it kind of makes you think, doesn't it, about what other homeownership costs might be lurking that aren't immediately obvious on day one. something to maybe explore further.